Octavia and Oscar Fairweather's love story began like a fairy tale. They met as undergraduates at Creekside College, where Octavia studied art, and Oscar pursued a degree in business administration. Octavia captivated Oscar from the moment he saw her by the campus lake. Oscar tall and charismatic, with a disarming smile. Would Octavia with his charm and ambition? They married shortly after graduation, with dreams of building a life together in their hometown. Octavia secured a position as an art teacher at high school, where her passion for creativity and nurturing young talent quickly made her a favorite among students and faculty alike. Oscar, leveraging his family connections, landed a job at a prestigious local investment firm, climbing the corporate ladder with remarkable speed. As the years passed, the Fairweathers became pillars of the Creekside community. They were fixtures at galas and town council meetings. Their home in Oakwood Estates, purchased with Oscar's growing wealth, became a symbol of their success. Octavia's artistic touch was evident in every room, from the hand-painted murals in the living room to the carefully curated sculptures in their backyard. To the outside world, Octavia and Oscar were the epitome of a power couple. They complemented each other perfectly. Octavia's creativity balancing Oscar's business acumen. Her warmth softening his sometimes brusque demeanor. Friends often remarked on how they still looked at each other with the same adoration they had in college. Yet beneath the surface of this picture-perfect life, there were undercurrents of tension. Octavia and Oscar had been trying to conceive for years without success. The strain of fertility treatments and dashed hopes began to wear on their relationship. Oscar threw himself into his work, spending long hours at the office, while Octavia found solace in her art and her students. It was during this challenging time that Octavia's relationship with her mother, Cordelia Prescott, became a source of comfort and support. Cordelia, a widow who lived on the outskirts of town, had always been a free spirit. In her youth, she had traveled the world as a photojournalist, settling down in Creekside only after meeting Octavia's father. After his passing, Cordelia had retreated into a quieter life, focusing on her garden and her volunteer work at the local animal shelter. As Octavia spent more time with her mother, Oscar found himself drawn into Cordelia's orbit as well. What began as polite conversation during family dinners slowly evolved into something more, setting the stage for a betrayal that would tear the Fairweather family apart. The seeds of the affair between Oscar and Cordelia were planted on a crisp, autumn evening. Octavia, consumed with preparing for an upcoming art exhibition featuring her students' work. Oscar, feeling neglected and frustrated by the growing distance in his marriage, decided to go to Cordelia's cottage alone, ostensibly to check on his mother-in-law. Cordelia, surprised but pleased by the unexpected visit, welcomed Oscar with a warm smile and a glass of her homemade wine as they sat in her small cluttered living room, surrounded by eclectic souvenirs from her travels. Oscar found himself opening up about his marital troubles. Cordelia listened with empathy, her eyes so similar to Octavia's, filled with understanding. Perhaps it was the wine, or the intimate atmosphere, or simply the need for human connection, but that night a line was crossed, a comforting touch lingered too long, a gaze held more meaning than it should have. By the time Oscar left Cordelia's cottage, both knew that something had irrevocably changed, and the weeks that followed, Oscar and Cordelia manufactured reasons to see each other. Cordelia suddenly needed help with home repairs, while Oscar discovered a newfound interest in gardening. Their clandestine meetings became more frequent, always carefully timed to avoid suspicion. During one of their early encounters, Oscar arrived at Cordelia's cottage to help fix a leaky faucet as they worked side by side in the cramped space of her bathroom. The air between them grew thick, with unspoken tension. Their hands brushed accidentally, sending electric shocks through both of them. When Cordelia reached past Oscar for a towel, he caught the scent of her perfume, a heady mix of jasmine and Vanilla that made his head swim. Their eyes met in the mirror, and for a moment neither could look away. On a warm Sunday afternoon, Cordelia was showing Oscar how to prune her rose bushes. As she demonstrated the technique, standing close behind him to guide his hands. Both were acutely aware of their physical proximity, the gentle brush of her breath on his neck. The warmth of her body against his back sent shivers down Oscar's spine. When he turned to ask a question, their faces were inches apart. Time seemed to stand still as they stood there, frozen in a moment of forbidden desire, during a rare moment alone at a family gathering. Oscar and Cordelia stole away to the secluded garden behind the house. Hidden from view by a trellis covered in climbing roses, they gave in to their desires. Their kisses were urgent, hands roaming with a desperation born of stolen moments. As they heard Octavia's voice calling for them, they quickly separated, straightening their clothes and hair. The guilt was immediate, but so was the thrill of their secret affair, adding a dangerous excitement to their illicit encounters. Their affair consumed them, blinding them to the consequences of their actions. In Cordelia's bedroom, a space once reserved for solitary nights, they now created a world of secret passion. The creak of bed springs and hushed whispers became a symphony of their illicit love, playing out against the backdrop of familial betrayal. As their physical intimacy deepened, so too did their emotional entanglement. What had started as a physical attraction morphed into something more complex and dangerous. They began to imagine a future together, heedless of the devastation such dreams would wreak on their family. It was this combination of physical passion and emotional connection that would ultimately lead to their undoing. They justified their actions in whispered conversations. Oscar spoke of feeling unappreciated and misunderstood by Octavia, while Cordelia confessed to a loneliness that had plagued her since her husband's death. They convinced themselves that their connection was special, something that transcended the boundaries of the conventional. As the affair deepened, so did their web of lies. Oscar began to invent business trips and late meetings. Cordelia feigned illness to avoid family gatherings. They communicated through a secret email account and disposable phones, always careful to cover their tracks. With each deception, the weight of guilt grew heavier. Oscar found it increasingly difficult to look Octavia in the eye, while Cordelia's interactions with her daughter became strained and awkward. The very relationship that had once been Octavia's source of comfort was now tainted by betrayal. Neither Oscar nor Cordelia could have foreseen the devastating consequences their actions would have on the entire Fairweather family. As they continued their illicit liaison, they remained oblivious to the suspicions beginning to form on Octavia's mind. The first inkling that something was amiss came to Octavia on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. She had decided to surprise Oscar with lunch at his office, only to be told by his confused secretary that he had left early, mentioning a meeting with a client. Octavia brushed it off as a miscommunication, but a seed of doubt had been planted. Over the following weeks, Octavia began to notice subtle changes in Oscar's behavior. He was more distracted, often lost in thought during their conversations. His phone would buzz at odd hours, and he would step out of the room to take calls in hushed tones. When questioned, Oscar would dismiss her concerns with vague explanations about work stress and important deals in the pipeline. Octavia's artistic sensitivity, usually a source of joy in her life, now became a curse as she picked up on minute details that others might have missed. The faint scent of unfamiliar perfume on Oscar's clothes, a lipstick smudge on a coffee mug he brought home from the office, the way he sometimes avoided her touch. All these observations accumulated in her mind, forming a picture she didn't want to see. Her relationship with her mother also began to change. Cordelia, once eager to spend time with her daughter, now seemed distant and preoccupied. Their weekly tea sessions became less frequent, with Cordelia often cancelling at the last minute, citing various commitments when they did meet. Octavia sensed a nervousness in her mother's demeanor, a reluctance to meet her eyes that was entirely out of character. As her suspicions grew, Octavia found herself trapped in a spiral of doubt and self-recrimination. She questioned every interaction, analyzed every word spoken by Oscar and Cordelia. Was she imagining things? Had the stress of their fertility struggles and her upcoming exhibition made her paranoid? Determined to find the truth, Octavia began to investigate discreetly. She checked Oscar's credit card statements, noting several charges at restaurants and hotels that he had never mentioned. She drove by her mother's cottage at odd hours, her heart sinking when she spotted Oscar's car parked down the street on an evening when he was supposedly working late. Each new piece of evidence felt like a physical blow, chipping away at the foundation of trust that had been the bedrock of her life. Octavia's students and colleagues noticed the change in her demeanor. The dark circles under her eyes, the tremor in her hands as she demonstrated brush techniques, the forced smile that never quite reached her eyes. As the days passed, Octavia became a shadow of her former self, torn between confronting her fears and clinging to the last shreds of hope that she was mistaken. Little did she know that the truth, when it finally came to light, would be even more devastating than she could have imagined. The day Octavia's world shattered began like any other. It was a Saturday, and she had spent the morning at the school putting the finishing touches on the student art exhibition. Oscar had left early, mumbling something about a golf game with clients. As Octavia drove home, her mind preoccupied with last-minute details for the upcoming show, she decided on a whim to stop by her mother's cottage. Perhaps a cup of tea and a chat would help calm her nerves, as Octavia turned onto the quiet lane leading to Cordelia's home. Her heart nearly stopped. There parked behind was Oscar's sleek black sedan. For a moment, Octavia sat in her car, hands gripping the steering wheel. She told herself there could be an innocent explanation, but deep down she knew. With trembling legs, Octavia approached the cottage. The curtains were drawn, but through a gap she could see movement inside. Taking a deep breath, she used her key to unlock the door, pushing it open as quietly as possible. The sight that greeted her would be forever seared into her memory. There on the floral-patterned couch, they were locked in an intimate embrace. Oblivious to the world around them, Cordelia's hair was disheveled, Oscar's shirt partially unbuttoned. On the coffee table, 2 half-empty wine glasses stood as mute witnesses to their betrayal. For a moment time seemed to stand still. Then, as if sensing her presence, Oscar and Cordelia looked up. The expressions on their faces: shock, guilt, and a flicker of defiance. What followed was a blur of emotions and accusations. Octavia's anguished cry broke the silence, startling the guilty pair. Oscar jumped to his feet, stammering excuses and pleas. Cordelia remained seated, her face ashen, tears streaming down her cheeks. Octavia, her voice raw with pain and fury, hurled questions at them. The answers, when they came, were like daggers to her heart. 6 months, it had started as friendship, then evolved. They hadn't meant for it to happen. They were sorry, unable to bear their presence any longer. Octavia fled the cottage. She drove aimlessly for hours, her mind replaying the scene over and over. By the time she returned home, the sun had set, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn of the house she had once considered her sanctuary. As she sat in the darkened living room, surrounded by the trappings of her seemingly perfect life, Octavia felt something inside her break. The pain, the betrayal, the sheer magnitude of the deception. In that moment, a cold resolve began to form in her heart. Someone would have to pay for this betrayal. And Octavia knew exactly who that someone would be. The events leading up to the fatal shooting unfolded over several tense hours on that warm summer evening. Octavia, having spent the day in a haze of grief and anger, found herself pacing the halls of her home like a caged animal. The tick of the clock and the foyer seemed to mock her, counting down the moments until her world would irrevocably change. As dusk fell, Oscar returned home. He entered cautiously, his usual confident stride replaced by hesitant steps. Octavia watched from the shadows of the dining room as he hung up his jacket and loosened his tie. The familiar routine now tainted by the knowledge of his betrayal. Oscar called out Octavia's name, his voice strained with apprehension. When she stepped into the light, he visibly flinched. The woman before him bore little resemblance to the vibrant, loving wife he had known. Octavia's eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. Her posture rigid with barely contained fury. Oscar, his face a mask of guilt and desperation, launched into a litany of excuses and apologies. He spoke of feeling neglected, of the pressures of work and their fertility struggles. He claimed the affair had been a mistake, a moment of weakness that had spiraled out of control. With each word, Octavia felt her anger rising, a tide of rage threatening to overwhelm her. Without fully realizing what she was doing, Octavia found herself walking to Oscar's study. She knew he kept a handgun in the desk drawer, a precaution he had insisted on after a series of break-ins in the neighborhood. As if in a trance, she retrieved the weapon, feeling its cold weight in her hand. When she returned to the living room, Oscar's eyes widened in shock and fear. He raised his hands, backing away slowly, his words now coming in a panicked rush. He promised to end the affair, to go to counseling, to do whatever it took to save their marriage. But Octavia barely heard him. In her mind, she saw only images of Oscar and Cordelia together, their betrayal playing on an endless loop. What happened next was a blur of motion and sound. Oscar lunged forward, perhaps trying to disarm her. In that moment of chaos and heightened emotion, Octavia's finger tightened on the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the confines of the room, followed by an eerie silence, broken only by the tinkling of shattered glass from a fallen picture frame. Oscar staggered backward, a look of disbelief on his face as he pressed his hand to his chest. Blood seeped between his fingers, staining his crisp white shirt crimson. He collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. His eyes locked on Octavia's in a silent plea. As the reality of what she had done crashed over her, Octavia dropped the gun. It clattered to the hardwood floor, the sound jolting her out of her shocked state. She rushed to Oscar's side, her anger instantly replaced by horror and regret. She pressed her hands against the wound, desperately trying to stem the flow of blood. Oscar's breathing was labored, his skin growing pale. With trembling hands, Octavia reached for her phone, dialing 911. Her voice shook as she gave the dispatcher their address, pleading for an ambulance to hurry. As she waited for help to arrive, she cradled Oscar's head in her lap, whispering a mixture of apologies and pleas for him to hold on. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. Neighbors alerted by the gunshot began to gather outside. Through the window, Octavia could see curious faces peering in, their expression shifting from concern to shock as they took in the scene. She heard muffled voices, someone shouting about calling the police. When the paramedics finally arrived, they worked swiftly to stabilize Oscar. Octavia watched, numb with shock, as they loaded him onto a stretcher and rushed him to the waiting ambulance. As the sirens faded into the distance, Octavia found herself alone in the house, surrounded by the evidence of her actions. It wasn't long before the police arrived. Detective Emily Davis took charge of the scene, her keen eyes taking in every detail. As officers secured the area and began collecting evidence, Detective Davis approached Octavia, who sat motionless on the blood-stained couch. In a gentle but firm voice, Detective Davis informed Octavia of her rights and asked if she understood what had happened. Octavia, her voice barely audible, recounted the events of the day. The discovery of the affair, the confrontation, and the moment the gun went off. Throughout her statement, she seemed almost detached, as if she were describing something that had happened to someone else. As Octavia was led away in handcuffs, the gravity of the situation began to sink in. She caught glimpses of her neighbors watching from behind hastily drawn curtains, their faces a mix of horror and fascination. At the General Hospital, Oscar Fairweather clung to life in the intensive care unit. The bullet had missed his heart by mere inches, lodging dangerously close to his spine. As he underwent multiple surgeries, a steady stream of colleagues and friends visited. Their hushed conversations in the waiting room filled with speculation and disbelief. Cordelia Prescott, racked with guilt and shame, attempted to visit her son-in-law but was turned away by the Fairweather family. She retreated to her cottage, refusing to answer calls or open her door. The weight of her role in the tragedy seemed to age her overnight. Her once vibrant demeanor replaced by a haunted, hollow-eyed look. Detective Davis, meanwhile, delved deeper into the case. She interviewed friends, colleagues, and family members, piecing together the events that had led to that fateful night. The more she uncovered about the Fairweather family's history and the affair between Oscar and Cordelia, the more complex the case became. As the investigation progressed, public opinion and Creekside began to shift. What had initially been seen as a clear-cut case of attempted murder in a fit of rage was revealed to be a tragedy born of betrayal and shattered trust. The town found itself divided, with some sympathizing with Octavia's plight, while others condemned her actions as inexcusable regardless of the circumstances. One of the most crucial pieces of evidence came from an unexpected source. Octavia's best friend and fellow art teacher Zara came forward with a series of text messages in the weeks leading up to the shooting. Octavia had confided her growing suspicions to Zara, detailing the signs of infidelity she had noticed. The messages revealed Octavia's emotional turmoil and her struggle to confront the truth, providing valuable insight into her state of mind. Inside the packed courtroom, the air was thick with tension as the judge called the proceedings to order. The prosecution, led by the ambitious District Attorney Vincent Harding, painted a picture of Octavia as a vengeful woman who had committed a premeditated act of violence. Harding argued that the shooting was not a crime of passion, but a calculated attempt to punish both her husband and her mother for their betrayal. Octavia's defense team, headed by the seasoned attorney, presented a different narrative. They portrayed Octavia as a victim of circumstances, a woman pushed to the brink by an unthinkable betrayal. Morales emphasized Octavia's impeccable character, her contributions to the community, and the extreme emotional distress she had been under at the time of the shooting. In their closing arguments, both the prosecution and defense made impassioned pleas to the jury. D.A. Harding emphasized the seriousness of the crime and the need for justice, while Morales urged the jurors to consider the extraordinary circumstances and Octavia's otherwise exemplary life. As the jury filed out to begin their deliberations, a hush fell over the courtroom. The fate of Octavia Fairweather now rested in their hands, and with it, the resolution of a tragedy that had shaken the town of Creekside to its core. After 3 days of intense deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. They found Octavia Fairweather guilty of aggravated assault, a lesser charge than the attempted murder the prosecution had pushed for. The courtroom erupted in a mix of gasps and murmurs as the verdict was read, with Octavia standing stoically beside her attorney. The judge, taking into account Octavia's previously unblemished record and the extraordinary circumstances of the case, sentenced her to 5 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 3 years. Additionally, Octavia was mandated to undergo psychological counseling and complete an anger management program. The sentence was met with mixed reactions. Some felt it was too lenient given the severity of others, believed it appropriately balanced justice with compassion. As Octavia was led away from the courtroom, the weight of her actions and the long road ahead seemed to finally settle on her shoulders. Oscar, having recovered from his physical wounds but forever changed by the experience, had moved to a different state. to start anew. He and Octavia had divorced during her incarceration, their communication limited to formal letters and occasional phone calls. Despite the pain of their shared past, there was a tentative forgiveness between them, born of mutual understanding and regret. Cordelia had retreated from public life entirely. She lived as a virtual recluse in her cottage, her only contact with the outside world being the occasional visit from a home health aide. The weight of her role in the tragedy had taken a severe toll on her health and spirit. As Creekside slowly heals and life moves forward, the story of Octavia, Oscar, and Cordelia remains a powerful reminder of how quickly and irrevocably lives can change. It challenges us to examine our own relationships, to value the trust placed in us by our loved ones, and to consider the far-reaching impacts of our choices.